Hello, everybody. I'm Katie Fahey,
And I'm Benjamin Singer.
and we're the co hosts of Behind the Ballot, a podcast about democracy reform on a local, state, and national level.
And shout out to our fellow co host, Brittany, who's not here today. We've all seen brokenness and corruption in how our democracy works. And the three of us have taken steps to reform and improve democracy in areas close to us.
Benjamin runs Show Me Integrity, a cross partisan organization in Missouri working to create a more ethical, accountable, and democratic state government. In 2018, Benjamin worked on redistricting and political reform ballot initiatives that passed statewide in Missouri, and later led two successful ballot initiatives transforming elections and government in St. Louis.
That's right. And to be clear, that's Democratic with a lowercase d. Katie is the executive director of The People, a national nonpartisan organization empowering everyday Americans to find common ground and take action together to create a government that is truly of, by, and for the people. Also in 2018, she led a coalition in passing a historic ballot initiative that ended gerrymandering in Michigan and became the gold standard for how to do that across the US. Today, we've got episode number 3 of Behind the Ballot. I'm really excited because we're talking with Dustin Gawrylow from the North Dakota Watchdog Network and Matt Schweich from the Voter Defense Association of South Dakota.
Previously, we interviewed leaders from national democracy organizations, and today we're talking with two state level activists leading grassroots efforts in their home states. Hi, Dustin. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
All right. Well, Matt, while he unmutes himself, and Matt's actually doing this outside with a beautiful background if you're not watching the video, we'd love for both of you to tell us your story, how you got into working on ballot initiatives as the people's tool, and especially the last couple of years, defending the process itself. So, Matt, I'm actually going to come to you first.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about this issue. It's an important one. I first got involved working ballot initiatives way back in 2014 in Rhode Island on a constitutional convention ballot question, a con, for those in the know. After that, I was hired by the Marijuana Policy Project, and I've run ballot initiatives on medical cannabis and recreational cannabis over the last 4 election cycles in states all over the country, and I've seen firsthand, lived and breathed all the idiosyncrasies of the process of doing an initiative in different states, whether it's the number of signatures, how you collect them, how you submit them, the format of your petition, the potential legal hurdles you might have to overcome. I've encountered these obstacles, dealt with them, and over time developed a real appreciation for the diversity of how our initiative process works. At the same time, I've witnessed a rise in attacks on the initiative process, and as I see it, the initiative process is one of the last functional things left in American democracy, and I think that almost all the attacks on the initiative process are done in bad spirit and are really motivated by a group's feelings on one particular policy issue. And in South Dakota, there was a Medicaid expansion initiative that was on the ballot. And I saw the legislature place a legislatively referred constitutional amendment called Amendment C, and they put it on the primary ballot instead of the general election ballot. That's when I think I got really angry. Like, how dare they try to make permanent changes to the initiative process and slide it by with a constitutional amendment on a primary ballot. That is what got me fired up. And our group, along with many others, opposed Amendment C and defeated it heavily, which was there's a very uplifting moment and gave me even more reason to want to work on initiative defense. And since then, I started an organization, Voter Defense Association of South Dakota, and we got involved in a legislative fight last year, and we were able to move the needle. A bill was passed that had to do with signature withdrawal, not a very good bill, but we were able to improve it a great deal and minimize the damage done. So it was an early legislative win. It makes me want to continue to stay active in state legislatures and be on the lookout, because ideally we could stop some of these attacks in the initiative process before they reach the ballot, which is a far more cost-effective use of resources than waiting for these anti-initiative initiatives to appear on the ballot when the stakes become much higher and the costs become exorbitant. So we need to get ahead of it in legislatures early on in sessions. And that's what we did this year, and what I'm excited to continue doing in the future.
That's great. And we'll definitely want to dive in a little bit later on, tips for people when they are trying to fight back against these attacks on this people's power of the initiative process. So Dustin, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from. I know you're, someone who's, I think you consider yourself maybe a conservative libertarian, something like that. Tell us about a little bit about you and your work, and how you came to be one of the leading defenders of the ballot initiative process in the state of North Dakota.
Yeah, so again, my name is Dustin Gawrylow. I am the managing director of the North Dakota Watchdog Network. Prior to that, I got started in the initiative process back in 2007 when I was working for the North Dakota chapter of Americans for Prosperity, when we launched a initiative to cut the state income tax by 50% across the board. And the attacks on us were from a basis of the language that we had put out. We'd used legislative council to develop our language for the ballot measure, and there was a few mistakes in it, and the Secretary of State decided to take it out on us by basically changing the ballot title after we collected all the signatures to something that was not what anybody signed on the petition itself during the petition process. And as a result, basically it confused the issue. And this was how we learned that a lot of the provisions that are in existing law, when it comes to the approval process, gives the Secretary of State a lot of leeway and a lot of discretion on these things. Over the now almost 2 decades since then, there have been dozens of attacks at the legislative level. Many of them have gone to the ballot to try to restrict the process, make it more difficult, increase the thresholds, et cetera, all because legislators simply do not like what the people vote for. The very people that vote those legislators in office and have created, in North Dakota's case, a Republican super duper majority, they don't like what the people vote for when things are actually on the ballot. And so we have also started efforts to try to reduce the ability of legislators to manipulate and obstruct the process of initiatives by proposing a lockout provision that says that only the people may initiate changes to the initiative measure process. So the legislature cannot have that shortcut. Now, we started collecting signatures in 2019 on that. COVID kind of got in the way in various ways, as it did with a lot of people. And it's something that's been on the back burner ever since. But in the meantime, in 2020, we defeated a major effort by the legislature, which was a measure that would have required 2 votes, with giving the legislature a veto over the people in between those 2 votes. That failed in 2020, and the result was that that now this election cycle, we are going into a situation where the legislatures come back with another measure that requires 2 votes in the same year at a simple majority, but they've also incorporated the single subject rule, which is something that is not defined at all and gives the Secretary of State way too much unilateral power in the process. And as we've seen in South Dakota, when you have a wide open single subject rule, you are opening yourself up to major problems down the road.
Thanks, Dustin. I think since all of us are very familiar with the ballot initiative process, like, it's already hard enough talking to a bunch of people about a major change you want to make in law or the Constitution. And then to see these hurdles that are thrown up by the legislature, by people in power like a Secretary of State's office, it's quite disheartening. But it's really exciting to hear both you and Matt bring up strengthening the ballot initiative process. How do we go on offense? How do we protect this process? So Matt, I know that you had kind of briefly mentioned that in your remarks, Do you want to tell me more about kind of either stuff you're involved with right now or how you've thought about ways that we can improve the ballot initiative process?
Sure. I'll just note that there's a certain shamelessness that's taken over with regard to how opponents of the initiative process operate. Placing 60% thresholds on primary ballots, or absurd double approval primary general. No state has that. These are embarrassing ideas that in the past, the norms of our political culture would have really prevented. But as with many things in our democracy, standards have been lowered. And you definitely see that with the manner in which these attacks are delivered, which means we have to be ready for anything now. To answer your question, I think the important thing to start with is we are capable of winning at the ballot box when the initiative process is on the line, right? If you look overall at when these questions have reached the ballot, attacks on the initiative process, usually we win. But I think it's wasted time and energy if we could avoid facing those on the ballot. And I think if we can start to win more in these legislatures, we perhaps dampen down the problem, and over time kind of take some of the wind out of the sails of opponents. If opponents in the initiative process are always able to get their terrible proposed change through committee, through the legislature, and put it on the ballot, they're just going to keep doing that. If you start to mess with their process, stop them in legislatures. Now they go through one committee in one chamber, but they can't get through the other. You're just creating friction for them. And we have to kind of get in their face, full court press, to use a basketball term. And so we need to be in these state legislatures, some of which are small, some of which have sessions that last 3 months. It's not easy to operate in many different state legislatures effectively. Once it's what MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project, did for many years. In some ways, I've learned from that model. But what you need is you need in your states where you're active, you've got to have people on the ground. You probably have a lobbyist of some kind, or a local advocate that can act and can work as a lobbyist. You need to be in that state house, living and breathing it. You need to understand the committees and where bills might flow, and be ready on a dime to organize testimony. Something we're starting to do is build a roster of local people who are committed to the cause, who volunteer their time to testify or appear in media or go on a local forum. So it's not just the staff doing everything, but there's actually a roster of real people that do things that aren't politics in their lives, that will show up and deliver a forceful message. And then you got to just learn to fight, run a grassroots legislative campaign. If there's a bill that's moving its way through, you need to start applying pressure, and hopefully built up lists of supporters who you can then call or text and tell them, hey, there's a really bad bill that would undermine the initiative process. Make sure you call your state senator. They're on a really important committee where it's expected to be a good vote. And we need to coordinate and share lessons from different states. That's an important balancing act. You need a different operation in every state. Each state deserves its own operation, no matter how big or small the state and population. You can't take a cookie cutter approach, but also it doesn't make sense to have 50 different groups doing different things, not sharing lessons. And that's the balancing act where hopefully you've got a network of groups that are doing this. And each state, there's different coalitions, there's different rosters, there's different threats, different difficult legislators, different challenges. So you want each state taking on those challenges in their own way. But then you also want to coordinate and understand and research you do to inform a particularly compelling testimony about a bill in South Dakota to raise threshold to 60. All that research can be put to good use in other states. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. That is inefficient use of scarce resources when you're doing the same policy research over and over again in different states. That's stupid. Writing good testimony in the voice of your roster, that should not be cookie cutter, right? Because if you do that, then the people on the testimony, you sound like some DC hired gun, right? You need local people delivering a real message in their words. But the research on how many states have ever considered changing their initiative process in this way, that only needs to be done once. And especially with how many attacks are coming at the initiative process, how difficult it is to raise funds for this work, which is a little nerdier as far as political, work goes. It's not something a lot of people think about every day. So we have to be very smart about how we use scarce resources. And while at the same time allowing each state to have its own character, have its own characters, its own strategies. And that's how it will be most effective, by having an approach that's tailored to each state, that at the same time is part of a wider effort that allows resources to be used in an efficient way. I've worked on too many underfunded campaigns to watch money go to waste. And if we're going to do this right and defend the initiative right, it's going to be a lot of work. There's a lot of states where we need to be active, where we're not. But it's an exciting opportunity, and people like us who are passionate about the initiative process, I think we're ready to jump in, but we need to make sure we're bringing a lot of people with us, because we're going to need allies if we're going to do this effectively in the long run. Sorry, that was probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but
that's all right. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, no, but it's a great point, and I'll segue to my next thing. But first, yeah, I want to emphasize what Matt's saying, because that's exactly what we're trying to do with the Respect Voters Coalition, and what Matt's trying to do with the Voter Defense Association is support these grassroots efforts across the country, help people share resources, share knowledge, share polling, share legal expertise in terms of different approaches. It's amazing how I've seen, living here in Missouri, and seeing what's been happening in other states like in North Dakota. There's so many strategies that can be shared, but it's not been happening because we haven't built that network. And a lot of political consultants just think they're the smartest person ever born and they don't need advice from anyone. But actually, there's a lot we can all learn from novel approaches that have been pioneered by people across the spectrum. So on that note, Dustin,
I just add,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'll shut up after this, I promise, but what you said made me think of something, which is, with the initiative process, there's a lot of, in terms of bringing people into this effort and them caring. Thankfully, the initiative process has been working really well in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of addressing instances where the will of the people is there for a change in policy, but politicians aren't listening. And I think if you look at across the landscape, voters have been making good decisions. So this should be an easy thing to get people to care about. But it is, it's a bit of a lift, and you've got to get them to think about an issue that they haven't really thought about before. But once they get it, they're like, yeah, I like the initiative process. Why are those politicians trying to take it away? So, I don't want to sound like we're selling something that's not interesting. It is interesting. It is important, but it's something new to a lot of people. They never thought about a signature, an initiative threshold requirement. They've never thought about it before.
Right.
But we can get them fired up.
Yes. So, on that note, I think no one is a better example of, someone who's really just trying to look out for the little guy, and doing what you were talking about, Matt, in terms of spending that time in the halls of the legislature, trying to make the case for the people, than Dustin Gawrylow in North Dakota. And people have such a short memory. Matt, you're talking about how the ballot initiative has been used the last 10 to 15 years. I think recently, because the Republicans have won so many legislatures, Democrats, or liberals, I suppose, have been using the ballot initiative process a lot because they've been out of power in so many states. And so people with short memories, including politicians who haven't been in office that long, think this is some liberal thing. But in fact, it's been used in red states across the country, or states we now think of as red states, by conservatives back when Democrats were in power. And people forget, and they fall into this lazy partisan narrative. And instead of thinking about right versus left, we should be thinking about people versus politicians. So Dustin, I want to come to you to give all of us a primer on that cross-partisan history of the ballot initiative process, how that process came into being and how it's been used kind of showing how across the spectrum, this has been a people's tool, not one political party's tool. And I know you are incredibly knowledgeable on like all the weeds, but if you can try to keep it high level for all of us regular people out here, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, I can get into my history professor mode on that issue. North Dakota was one of the leaders on initiatives and referendums going back to the 19 teens, and our
We were
NPL
first. South Dakota had to say it. You set it up. Founder of the initiative process.
Right, and the from a high level, when they implemented that, they used it strongly, and the irony is that the use of the initiative process was back in the days when Republicans were considered to be the progressives, and so the folks that considered themselves progressive had to infiltrate the Republican circles and then also use the initiative process to get what they wanted done. You fast forward to the 1980s when the Democrats were actually running a lot of state houses, especially governor's offices, in what are Midwest red states now. There was a lot more competition. In North Dakota, we had a history where the Senate kind of flipped between the two parties. The House usually was Republican. The governor's office was from the late 50s till 1992. Almost exclusively Democrat for 40 years. There was only like 4 or 8 years of Republican in that span. And so in 1989 was when the people really started using the initiative process, and we had referrals and initiatives and those sorts of things fighting against Democrat policies in what is now a red state. And as a result, that led to basically the downfall of the Democratic Party in North Dakota and the rise of the Republican Party. Now, it probably would have happened eventually, but the initiative process actually accelerated that probably by a decade, if not more. And so now in the last 25 years, conservatives and liberals have used the initiative process. I'd say in the last 8 years, liberals have really been using it more, but what has really aggravated the situation in North Dakota is the out-of-state money. And the legislators genuinely believe that the out-of-state money is coming in, manipulating our system and our way of life. And their response is to make the overall process more difficult. Now, my contention against that is when you make the process more difficult, you're making it more expensive. The people that already have access to $5 or $10 million to do initiatives in North Dakota are not going to have any problem raising a few million more bucks. It's the little guy like Rick Becker or somebody of that nature who's doing a grassroots effort that does not have millions of dollars at their disposal. So the approaches that the legislature takes in order to try to remedy what they see as the problem with the out-of-state influence, out-of-state money, actually ends up hurting their own citizens and the genuine grassroots voters, their own voters that they rely on more, because those people don't have the resources to use in the first place. And so when you try to make the process more difficult to block out the out-of-staters, what you're really doing is punishing your own people. And the out-of-staters are still going to use the process, still going to come in and run roughshod. And so it's a misdiagnosis of a solution, really, in a lot of legislators, and this goes cross-partisan. Like there are Democrats that are, even though they agree with a lot of these things, they will say they don't like the out-of-state money. Now, because traditionally the animosity against out-of-state interests was actually a Democrat progressive idea. Back, if you go back to the farming days, you know, whether it's during the Great Depression or the 80s, when you had the banks foreclosing on farms, it was always this out-of-state, evil out-of-state mentality. And now things have flipped so much, and part of this is the populist shift amongst the party lines. And so we're constantly fighting elected officials who somewhat have diagnosed the problem correctly, but their solution is not going to fix it. It's going to make it worse. And so our challenge is explaining to them that, number one, if you're genuinely concerned about these out-of-state influences, you're not going to do it by restricting your own people's ability to fight back. In fact, not only does it make it easier for those out-of-state interests to come in and manipulate, and harder for your own to use the process, it makes it harder to turn back the policies that you disagree with. And so everything is counterintuitive, but there's this emotional mentality that by doing this, by making the process harder, they're going to fix something, when really, I believe it's just going to make the problems that they believe are there even worse.
Such a good point. And I think, we see money in politics being an issue far outside of the ballot, how much of those are costing compared to what they used to. So I think kind of a different problem that they're trying to put onto this. Beyond kind of the outside money point, Dustin and Matt, I'm interested in what you guys are seeing as why legislators across the country, including in the Dakotas, want to attack this IP process. I think generally the average American believes in checks and balances, and I think definitely believes that politicians can sometimes be self-serving and aren't always addressing the issues they want to do. So I think even though kind of to your point, I think, Matt, that not everybody knows what this initiative process is. Once they learn about it, they tend to think it's a pretty good idea. But why do you guys think that legislators are against this, besides kind of outside money arguments?
I think it's almost entirely motivated just by objections to specific initiatives. It's not based in principle. We can articulate principled statements about why we believe the initiative process is a valuable and important tool, instrument of democracy, and how it serves as a check and balance. They can't. They talk about the abortion initiative they didn't like. They talk about the Medicaid expansion initiative they didn't like, the cannabis initiative they didn't like. And that's the shamelessness that I referred to earlier. Like if they were going to do this with some integrity and honor, they would cite the initiatives, the policies they thought were mistakenly, enacted, and then they would make some kind of principled case on why the legislative process is needed, why a deliberative committee process is needed on public policy now more than ever. They could concoct some arguments. They don't even bother. They just say, look at that abortion thing we hate, and that's why we need to stop initiatives, or look at all the out-of-state money. And Dustin's absolutely right that if they are able to hang their hat on anything close to legit, it's the out-of-state money. But to that I say, first, I'm glad to quit everything I'm doing and work on getting rid of money in politics. That's my dream job. So if you're hiring Republican state legislators, please interview me. That's my dream job. Number two, if you care about money in initiative campaigns, then go ahead and write a law that restricts donations to initiative campaigns, or add more disclosure requirements, some things you have not done. Maybe enlighten yourselves as to the need to send reasonable people to the U.S. Senate and to the Supreme Court, so that we have reasonable decisions about the role of money in politics on a grand scale in this country. It's hard to believe that they care that much about money in politics when they don't take basic steps to add teeth to their own campaign finance disclosure. Money, out-of-state money, as though ruining the initiative process itself is their only available option, right? In South Dakota, the rules on donating to ballot initiative campaigns are very loose, like in many states. I support restricting them. I'll testify in support of that bill that adds disclosure requirements to ballot initiative campaign committees in South Dakota. I support that. But to say that the need for that is then a need to wreck something that's an important piece of the political system is ridiculous. It's like Dustin said, it's just like a gross misdiagnosis. But that's what we're contending with, and we have to, we can't get sucked into that. This is an important thing. We need to hold our principled ground, talk about the initiative process as a tool for effectuating the will of the people, talk about its historic place in the state's history, talking about how now more than ever we need to make sure that voters can fix things themselves. We can't get into fighting on the terrain they want to fight on, which is abortion a good or bad thing? Is cannabis legalization a good or bad thing? Is Medicaid expansion or minimum wage or paid family leave, are these things good or bad things? That's the wrong argument. The argument is, do you believe that voters should have a mechanism to make decisions on any public policy issue? And so they're going to try to brand us as the liberal defenders of abortion and cannabis and all these things, because the fact is, in many states, most of the impactful substantive ballot initiatives that passed have been things that are on the left. And so that tees them up for this attack. And we have to be ready for it. And we have to have former Republican elected officials who could never be described as liberal going on TV and making the case. We have to make sure that we're presenting as bipartisan, not get sucked into their game of making this a partisan issue by issue debate, because then we're on shakier ground. That's
totally
tricky.
agree. Yeah, and even like our name, we need to like respect the voters, which are cross-partisan, and they will ultimately decide on the ballot initiative process. Their votes are the ones that will end up saying, does this pass or doesn't it? So let's respect their will. Dustin, anything you have to add on other attacks that you see, or reasons for, I guess, attacking the ballot initiative process in the legislature?
Well, what I see, there are actually within, like in states like North Dakota and South Dakota, there are two sets of Republican factions that are against the initiative process for different reasons. You have the insider establishment faction that just sees it as a challenge to their power. And that's actually the easy group to argue against. The other group are the genuine philosophical conservatives who genuinely believe that because America is a republic and not a democracy, that the voters shouldn't decide issues. And while it's the weaker of the two arguments from a practical standpoint, from a genuineness, the people that believe that are far more genuine. They're not arguing that position simply to boost their own power. It's just because they genuinely believe that the voters can't be trusted. The establishment also believes that voters can't be trusted, except for that they get themselves voted by those very same voters. And so it's important to understand that these two groups are very keen on this. Now, the establishmentarians who are there for their own power structure, we're never going to convert them. They have their own reasons, but the philosophical conservatives are the ones that can be flipped with the argument that it is the establishment that is keeping those very philosophical conservatives out of power themselves and putting them in a corner. And so while they may not agree with the idea of direct democracy, it's going to be their last refuge when it comes time to getting the policies that they want passed, because the establishment, generally speaking, is not going to go along with them. And so that's why getting the philosophical conservatives who are not there just for their own power on board and converted into this, understanding that even if you don't think of this as an ideal, pragmatically, this is your last hope when it comes to a lot of these issues to get what you want. And so being able to have a message that brings both the left, if from a minority aspect in a red state in, as well as the conservatives, who are also another minority in a red state, because the mainstream folks are not there for the same reasons as those philosophical conservatives. So, what we need to be very careful about is making sure that we explain to people what the motivations are in those lanes, because if the philosophical conservatives believe that they are in the same camp as the establishment people just for different reasons, then that's how this right goes away, is when people think that they're agreeing for the right reasons when they're agreeing for the wrong reasons.
I just want to add.
I don't want to put.
If real quick, I think what Dustin's saying and how he says it is such a strong reminder that we need state-based local operations with people who live and breathe the state and know the history. It's so important. And one thing I've learned that's interesting is working on cannabis and other areas of public policy, it's really like what's going on right now. How's it working in other states right now? What are the revenue numbers, arrests going down, to use examples. Whereas this issue, defending the initiative process, you do want to talk about history. You do want to talk about the political traditions of the state, things happening at the turn of the last century, over 100 years ago. It's an issue where knowing the state and understanding what buttons to push with the right type of conservatives Dustin was just discussing. It's a different type of animal than just a pure, what should tax policy be? What should reproductive rights be? What should cannabis be? What should minimum wage be? Those are just like right here and now what's going on. I very rarely have talked about the history of cannabis, policy when advocating for the bills I've worked on. Very, very rarely comes up. Whereas on this, history is a valuable weapon that we have. And when you have someone who knows it, then you can use it. And so that's I think important thing about this work in the defending the issue process. It is a different type of animal than just a pure public policy issue like the ones we're used to debating. And that's just why we need state-based, run groups that can really apply the best possible approach for that state.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think your last point's really interesting too, because, we think about the ways that you can pass laws right now, obviously the legislature, but litigation is another way to try and get accountability. And I kind of look at the ballot initiative process as like, it's another tool for trying to get accountability. And I think, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I think we would all agree, like, the whole reason to keep the ballot initiative process is not so that every single law starts getting passed that way. We aren't looking to just change democracy to be a direct all the time democracy, but it's for those special cases where, for whatever reason, oftentimes because we're dealing with bills that maybe go against self-interest of the legislators, like we have a pathway where the citizens still have to approve it. They still have to sign on for it to even be put up to the voters, and then the voters ultimately still need to vote on it for kind of these tough issues that, shouldn't be every single issue going to the ballot, but for those special instances, how do we keep that lane of accountability?
Well said.
Yeah, it's such an important point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if we allow our ballots to be crowded, we need to be responsible stewards of the initiative process. Many of us who are doing this initiative work have worked on initiatives as professionals. And I'm always mindful of, I think the biggest threat to the initiative process in South Dakota is repeated elections with far too many initiatives on the ballot. And so that hasn't been a problem. But it's what you said so important. We're not initiative anarchists. In fact, we appreciate the levers that create the balance and understand them better than anybody. That's, in terms of how states arrived where they are now, how many signatures are needed, what's the timeline? Those are policies that are attuned to that state and developed over a long period of time. And then you have opponents initiative process basically like delivering a shock to the system. Because in most states, you do have the right balance where the number of signatures is where it should be so that your ballot isn't too crowded, but there's still a path to get to the ballot. That is a fine balance. And I don't want to drop signature requirements to 100 signatures anybody's on. Like, that would be terrible. Terrible for public policy, terrible for the initiative process, just bad way of governing. And so it's really important we remind people, like, we want I would say a conservative, fair, and still quite restrictive system, but one that's still there for the people and retains this important right. We can't be seen as too loosey-goosey. We have to remind people that no, we want there to be a hurdle, pretty tough hurdle. I've lived and breathed that hurdle. It's really stressful. Katie has, everybody here has. It's already really stressful to get on the ballot. Keep it really stressful. Don't make it impossible. Don't make it like anybody can do it. And then people think, oh, you're not just some kind of radical who thinks everything should be passed by initiative and we shouldn't even show up and peer. No, I don't think that at all. I think there should be, what we've seen 3 or 4 a year, and then they can see you as a reasonable person. But it's just really important that we maintain that balance.
Yeah, what about this conversation is if it wasn't already clear to everyone listening, we've got, two advocates from the two Dakotas, from different sides of the political spectrum, but all agreeing that we want to protect the people's power. And I want to synthesize briefly before we move on to our next question. And it doesn't sound like you might have something to say, so I want to let you say that too. But on the money piece, they complain about the out-of-state money, and yet you look at what's coming into the candidates' coffers for most of these candidates, especially statewide, and usually or often a huge portion of it is out of state, and there's just blatant hypocrisy there. And we do live in a federalist system. And Dustin, you spoke to something about, the idea that we live in a republic. And so some people fundamentally disagree with this idea of direct democracy anyway. But what people also are losing sight of there in their oversimplification is different levels of government have different levels of accountability to the citizens. The US Constitution should be a broad framework. State constitutions, local city charters, it's appropriate to get a lot more specific in terms of the closer you are to the people, the more a local community can have a say over how they want their community to look. And there's nothing wrong with that. And in terms of trusting the process, Matt, when you were saying these arguments are over a specific issue, well, do we believe that if there's a Supreme Court decision you don't like, we should then pack the court every time that happens, or anytime a law passes we don't like? We should, eliminate the number of, eliminate the legislature because we don't like a particular law they pass. That's radical. That is not conservative. To want to change the whole political system because there was one law passed that you don't like, or two laws passed. And we've seen, so here in Missouri, and I want to pivot back into, and I want you both to get specific in terms of defending the initiative process. We've seen a coalition called Conservatives Against Corruption here in Missouri be really outspoken in terms of protecting the integrity of the initiative process, because they see it as a check on the overreach of government. If government's going off the rails, if government's not following the will of the people, it's an escape valve. It's a backup plan. It's a last resort to have a check on what can be seen as government overreach from the right side of the political aisle. So, Dustin, if there was a point you wanted to make, I want to let you make that, and also ask both of you, what have you seen as the key in your states, in North Dakota and in South Dakota, to defeat the ballot initiative process? Because I know you've both won in the past. Dustin, you won when it was on the ballot and you got the word out that this is bad policy, it needs to be stopped. And Matt, I know you stopped it in the legislature. And I want you both to maybe give a couple examples or stories of how you were able to campaign to defeat those attacks. Go ahead, Dustin.
Well, yeah, and the key to all this is messaging about how regardless of your philosophy on what ideal government is, we have a system now. And the system now allows the citizens to establish the framework and terms and conditions by which their government operates. It is the classic we the people, the spirit of the Tea Party movement, the genuine Tea Party, not the fake one, is to give we the people the power to control what the elected officials do. So often the very same legislators that complain about, well, Congress works for us, they should be doing what we want, are the ones that reject the idea that the people should be able to establish the terms and conditions for them. And so making that clear is very important, that the people shouldn't use it for every little thing, but when the legislature is letting things slide or doing the wrong things, that's when the people are supposed to come in. I have pushed proactive approaches to this. In 2019, I got a bill put in place that would have restricted donations to ballot measure committees to 50% out of state. So for every dollar that you bring in state, you're able to raise a dollar out of state. The idea being that if you could raise $5 million in North Dakota, you deserve $5 million from California. And also a provision that restricted single donors to no more than 30% of that donor pool. The opposition was the president of a advertising company that worked primarily for the Republican Party, and he cited Citizens United. Whenever the issue of the candidates and where they bring their money in comes up, they don't want to talk about that because they want to hide behind Citizens United and the other court cases that have come down to strengthen that. Another reform that we proposed last session in 23 was, let's create an online signature system where it makes it easier to get signatures. We'll trade that for a higher threshold. If it's easier to get the signatures, we could double the requirement for how many. We should be increasing the amount of citizens involved in these things, but making it easier to get their signatures. So rather than making it harder, we should encourage more people to be involved and facilitate that involvement so that there's less money needed for the grassroots to be involved. Now, guys like Matt would be obsolete in a lot of states if we had that, but when it comes to paid positioning side, but you've got
I always said to cannabis people, put me out of business as a cannabis ballot initiative person. Like, that would be what's best for mayor. Please put me out of business. Make me totally unnecessary, because then we wouldn't need initiatives, because you all are getting things done in legislature. So I'm all about being made obsolete. It's my dream.
Yeah. So ultimately, this is all about the people versus the power. And the people, the elected officials need to understand that this is another check and balance. The people are the ultimate source. The conservatives and the Republicans that talk about the Constitution and things like that always refer to where the source of the power is, which is from the people. But yet they forget it when it comes to this, because they think that they're supposed to be the ones in charge rather than the ones that are working for the people. And ultimately, you're going to see some sort of pushback on a lot of this, and from the public once they realize what is being taken from them. If the legislators, I genuinely believe, if the Republican legislators in North Dakota got what they wanted, at some point the people are going to want to fight back, and they're going to realize that their own elected officials took that power from them, and they're going to kick Republicans out of office because of it. I don't know the timeline on that. That could be 4 years, that could be 24 years or 40 years, but eventually, if these elected officials get what they say they want, it's going to cost them down the road.
So a couple points to add. In terms of stopping bad bills, for me, the number one rule of the legislature is the default is to do nothing, right? So you're just trying to maintain the default, giving them reasons to go, maybe we shouldn't do this. Let's put it away for next year. That's the dream, right? Whatever the state-specific term for, what every state's got its own fun little, way of saying it, that set to the 76th day or whatever it is. That's the default. One specific thing we did this last session, we're facing a bill that would have allowed signature withdrawal from petitions. There's only 3 states that allow this. It's rare. It's not a good idea. It's just as a matter of principle. My principled belief I'll lead with, which is, you shouldn't be able to sign a petition and unsign it. Why are you making a signature mean nothing? We should have some sense of responsibility and accountability for the average voter. You sign a petition, you should know what you're signing and not be able to undo your signature. Also, if you change your mind, vote against it. This is a signature to put on a petition to put it on the ballot. It's not the be all and end all. So I don't think there's any good reason for signature withdrawal. But I knew that, outright killing this bill, saying, oh, it's a bad thing and we'll go away. No, we had to slow it down. We had to improve it, and take out some of the potential damage. So, the specific tactic was reminding legislators that they might be creating a problem in terms of opening up opportunities for litigation. And so in South Dakota, there was a major court case, which I helped lead, the Amendment A ruling, which overturned recreational cannabis. It was an unpopular ruling. It was based on the single subject rule. The way that Governor Noem funded the state's involvement was unpopular, and it led to our easy attack of, you're wasting taxpayer dollars to undermine the will of the people. And so we reminded them about Amendment A. Remember how angry everybody was about Amendment A? Well, you might be creating litigation because your bill's so sloppy and open-ended that you will be blamed for. You're going to create a mess. Legislators don't want to create a mess. And so we highlighted specific problems, that there was not a notarization wasn't required on the withdrawal, that it could be submitted digitally. And we said, this is so poorly written, so ripe for abuse, that you're going to open up litigation, and we will blame you for the legal bill that taxpayers pay on this stupid litigation because you wrote a bill that is just not properly written. And we actually made significant improvements to that bill. It's now notarized. It's ink. It's not an easy system. It went from a very easy, something that could be abused, online signature withdrawal chaos, to a pretty buttoned up, like a petition drive process for withdrawing signature. That to me was a win in given the political environment and what we're dealing with in the legislature, to make that bill a lot less bad and avoid potential lawsuits and damage to the issue process and uncertainty. That was a win. And in fact, Senator Schoenbeck, the Republican leader in the Senate, he actually said publicly, I heard their nuanced arguments about how the notarization was needed and how they weren't on equal standing, the signature and withdrawal process. And it made me look at the bill again. And so that made me feel great, because we weren't just like beating a drum. Oh, you're so bad attacking the issue process. How dare you? We were making detailed, policy specific, smart arguments that actually resonated. And so to me, that's the model going forward. And the other thing I'll say very quickly is, in terms of proactively improving the initiative process, my strategy for South Dakota is start by defeating bad things, be on the defensive, and then advocate for very modest technical improvements that nobody could disagree with, and gain some credibility to then fix or improve bigger things down the road. For example, a really funny example, the petition has a really small box for where you stamp your notary stamp. There's a standard box size for notary stamps based on California that's used across all different types of notarizations. Make the box bigger. Remove this line that's cluttering it, that's been ruled invalid by a court ruling. And we could show them, here's the petition before and after. They see, oh, that's nice. You have made that a better, more legitimate document where we can check the signatures better. And so start with technical little fixes, play defense, build yourself up, and then maybe down the road actually proactively improve it in a bigger way. But I want to be patient on that front because it kind of spreads us too thin to be saying, oh, here's a new innovation to make the initial process better, while also fighting bills that could destroy it. It's almost tone deaf to be ambitiously trying to fix it in big ways right out the gate when you're playing defense across. Like, well, I'm not going to sponsor your bill. There's like 5 bills that are trying to kill you guys. Like, what are you doing? So I think patience is a good thing there, but each state will be different.
That's right. And on your note earlier of having that state by state knowledge and making those arguments, I heard from one legislator in Missouri who read some of the arguments that we had made and gave him the courage to vote no on these attacks against the wishes of his caucus, because our Conservatives Against Corruption Coalition was reminding them, remember when conservatives were using the IP process to limit taxing and spending in state government, and the Democratic legislature tried to change the process to make it more difficult, and Governor John Ashcroft vetoed these attacks and said you shouldn't be limiting the people's power who don't have influence with their legislators to shape their government, to take their case directly to the people. And we lose what Katie said earlier in so many of these philosophical and political arguments. Like you said, Matt, remember, this is going to a vote of the people. What's wrong with that? Why not let the people vote? That's insane. So Katie, I think, is going to have the last question for us to wrap up.
What are you scared of?
Yeah, what are you scared of? The people who elected you?
Right, exactly.
They are.
I think yeah, exactly. But I do think that's kind of to your point too, Benjamin, and the point Dustin and Matt that you were both bringing up too. I think that's why this is so powerful, is that when we can let it just exist, the issues might be different depending on the year, because the voters are different depending on that year. What's being ignored is different depending on that year. but it being able to be a tool for decades, I think just helps keep an openness to a fail-safe, an ability to, when, because it's not easy, it's exhausting, it's stressful, I think was the word you used. Like it's not easy to do passing these initiatives, but at least it's a pathway to trying to get some accountability on issues that otherwise might be being ignored. And I think that's the other thing too, when we start trying to screw with it for short-term reasons, we're denying future generations the ability to make the best decisions for their government. But we've only got a couple minutes left, and I just thank you both, first of all, for all of the work that you are doing, and look forward to continuing to hear about your successes in the future and the ways that we can help. But we've got a range of practitioners who also are like both of yourselves, who use the ballot initiative process. We also have folks who are just learning about the ballot initiative and thinking about, is this even in my state? How should I use it? Will I use it? Those kinds of things. And so I guess my last question would be, why should voters across the political spectrum, maybe even if the party they like is in charge in their state right now, or isn't in charge in the state where they are right now, why should voters across the political spectrum protect this initiative process at this time? So I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I would say because everything in politics and history is cyclical. What goes around comes around. And even if you've got a state like North Dakota where we're 87% Republican legislature with Republican governor, outside of a dozen legislative districts, if you have a D behind your name, you're not getting elected in North Dakota unless you've got $5 million of your own money to float. And even then, it's going to be uphill. But that can change just as easily. The tides turn back and forth, as we're seeing nationally. Who would have ever thought that states like Georgia or North Carolina would be in play and would be purple leaning blue? Who would think that prior to Joe Biden dropping out, that Minnesota would even be on the table for Donald Trump? Minnesota hasn't gone Republican in 50 some years, not since Eisenhower. So everything changes eventually, and the way that the two parties are swapping spots on so many issues, it's just a matter of time before the people are not in sync with their elected leaders. And when that happens at the state level, you need a backstop. This is the backstop and the safety net for the people to ensure that their government does not become runaway. We hear a lot about runaway constitutional conventions, but we can get runaway legislators too when there is not a legitimate opposition party to hold them accountable. And the only people that can hold them accountable are people within their own party who get ostracized and marginalized. And those folks still need to have an ability to go to the people and say, this is what's going wrong. We need you to help us fix it. And that goes for left and the right. And I think that there's a natural inclination for moderates to be the bad guys on this issue, because moderates love the status quo. They just go with the flow. Whatever happens, they'll deal with it. It's the people on the left and the right that are looking for positive change in their own perception that don't have that mechanism to push things in the middle. And so that's why you have the left and the right utilizing these processes. At the end of the day, that is what is going to prevent your corruption and your hubris in government, where it gets disconnected from the people. And that is exactly what the founders wanted. The folks, the conservative folks that talk about the founders were for the republic, not the democracy. They forget that the democracy that the founders left in place was the Second Amendment democracy, which is a different kind of democracy that we want to avoid. And so if you are genuinely about what the founders wanted, you look at the big picture of what they saw the government being built off of, rather than just worrying about your sliver in time.
I'll make it real quick.
Yeah.
If I'm talking to a voter in one of the 24 states with an initiative process, I say to them, there's two ways to make laws in your state. You can do it with your fellow voters, or politicians can do it. And there are people that want to take away your ability to do it. Well, in my opinion, the only reason for that is if the politicians have gotten really, really good. They're just, so good at policymaking that we can just entrust them entirely with making all of our laws for us. Is that what you see? Is that what the people around you see? No, I see a political culture that's barely tolerable. I see a class of politicians on the left and the right that's barely tolerable. I saw this country come within inches of an atrocious set of decisions for the presidential election. I don't care if you're left or right, Trump or not Trump or Biden. Terrible set of options. Now it's a little better, but I see a political a democracy that is really in bad shape with regard to the politicians. And I hope one day we can improve that. I hope that Americans start making better decisions about the people that they send to office. Thankfully, they're pretty good at making decisions when it's just a policy in front of them. Why would you get rid of that? Do you really think politicians have gotten so good these days that now we should just let them make all of our decisions? I see the opposite. I see politicians getting worse. I see political culture getting worse. I see the political parties getting worse. And I see this tool, this power that we have, a power that few people on earth have, where you and fellow citizens can band together and write a law and collect signatures and work really hard and convince fellow voters to support it. You have that power, unique power few human beings on earth have, that fewer than half the states have. And you want to give it up to this political culture, to this set of politicians? Come on, like, what are you thinking here?
Well said. And I think that's the perfect place to wrap up, because that's what this Respect Voters Coalition is all about, is protecting this power and deploying and using the power of the citizen ballot initiative process to reform our political system, to hold our leaders more accountable, decrease corruption, increase accountability to the people, so we can get a better set of options, make incentives better and more accurate to reflect the will of the people of this country that we're so lucky to live in, that gives us this freedom to hold our leaders accountable. So if you want to be part of this, make sure you go to respectvoters.org and join our coalition, sign our open letter, alerting the American people that this freedom is under attack, and working to help protect, expand, and use this freedom for a more accountable government. Thank you to Dustin and Matt. Make sure you check out the North Dakota Watchdog Network and the Voter Defense Alliance of South Dakota. I'm Benjamin Singer.
And I'm Katie Fahey. Thank you.
Thank you.